"Hey, Sarge, look at this." Hank looked up from his phone and saw that one of the inmates had raised a scarecrow in front of the leaf pile he'd been making. He was unsurprised to find it was Jasper. Jasper had always been more of a talker than a worker, and today it was clear that his rake hadn't seen much use. He had come across an old green button-up shirt and stuffed it with leaves, making the body bulge oddly. He put a sack head on top to complete the ugly old golem, and drew a crude scarecrow face on the front. The whole work had been stuck on top of a broken rake handle, and stuck in the ground before the ever-growing leaf pile. It hung there like a silent guardian, as the inmates raked their pile closer and closer to the growing mound. Hank wanted to be angry with Jasper, but honestly, this was a great idea. "Well, look at that, Jasper. You made us a little mascot." "I didn't make him, Sarge. He told me how to put him together. His name is Grun." "He tell you that too?" Hank asked, beginning to get a little tired of this game already. Jasper nodded. "Whispered it to me when I found his head in that ditch." Hank sighed before telling Jasper to get back to work and return to the bus. As he slid into the cab of the van, he picked up the dummy phone and texted Al the location. "Look for the scarecrow with the sack head," he typed. And when Al, or whoever was manning the phone, sent back a string of question marks, Hank elaborated. "One of the inmates made a scarecrow. You can't miss it." As Al sent back a thumbs up, Hank sat back in his chair and reflected on how this was the easiest job he had ever had. Hank had worked for the Department of Corrections for about 5 years. He had only been a sergeant on the road crew for about 4 months, though. The job wasn't particularly hard, and Hank mostly found himself sitting in the cab of his work van and watching Netflix on his phone. He would count M8s or inspect the job site every now and again, but the job was mostly sedentary. The reputation he had built up for himself as a badass on the compound meant that none of these guys really messed with him, but that wasn't too surprising. The guys they sent to work squad were short-timers, guys with a few years left, and you didn't really get hard cases or mushy brains out here on the road. So far, Hank had only had to point his gun at one person, and the sight of that gleaming black barrel had taken the fight right out of him. It had been pretty boring until Al had come along. Al had found him drinking alone in a local bar, and Hank had marked him as trouble from the second he'd caught sight of him sneaking peeks at him. It was something about working behind the fence. You gained the ability to judge someone at a glance, and what they wanted, what they were capable of, and Hank had mistrusted Al from the get-go. Al had come to sit next to him and offered to buy him a drink, which Hank had declined. He told him thanks, but he wasn't into men. Al had laughed before asking if he was into money. Hank started to get mad, but Al told him that he had a different sort of offer for him. He bought him another round and asked if he'd like to talk it over. Hank had leaned back, taken a sip from the fresh PBR, and invited Al to proceed. Hank had his beer, and he listened. Al's request was simple. Al, or more likely the people Al worked for, wanted to use their leaves. That was all. "I've seen your boys out there working. I know how big your leaf piles are at the end of the day. All I'm asking is that you let us use your leaf piles to store some things discreetly." "I don't know," Hank said. "Guys in the department that try to diversify their income tend to end up wearing blues." "How much do you make on a day sitting in your van and watching these fellas work?" Al asked, getting right to the point. Hank thought about it. 400, he said, hoping it sounded confident. It was a lie, but not a big one. "How would you like to make twice that?" Al asked, smiling his shark's grin. Hank waffled as he thought about it, knowing he should say no. It was a bad idea to mix business with financial stability. But Hank was in a little bit of credit card debt and needed a way out. It was stupid, a surefire way to get himself thrown in prison. But as he reached over to shake Al's hand, it just felt so right. And that was how Hank had begun his employment with the less than reputable elements of the city. The setup was easy. The inmates raked up the leaves along the highway. They piled them up, adding to the pile daily, and at the end of the month, they burned the leaves and started again the next month. At night, Hank's newfound benefactor would dump something into one of those leaf piles, something Hank didn't need to know about. At the end of the month, Hank and his crew would burn that thing along with the leaves. and then the next month, they'd do it all over again. Each day that Hank continued to not know about this thing in the leaf pile, he would net a cool $400 in his account. It was almost too good to be true, and was great until that damn scarecrow showed up. 2 days after that horrid guardian had been erected, Hank started to feel like something wasn't right. He would find himself sitting in the cab of the bus, watching Netflix or something on his phone, when he suddenly felt like he was being watched. He'd look up and count the inmates, coming up with 20 men all at work, or at least not standing around. More often than not, it was the scarecrow Hank would find looking at him, giving him the creeps. It always seemed to have turned on its post, its grease-paint eyes always glaring at him, judging him. Hank would always turn back to his screen and just try to ignore it, but it gave him the willies to be sure. By the end of the first week, he'd made 2,000 bones for doing nothing more than just not reporting something, and he was feeling pretty good about the setup. His creditors were satisfied with the money Hank had given them, and Hank had sliced up a few of the cards that had gotten him into this situation in the first place. He didn't need the credit cards anymore, now that he was making the kind of money that Al was providing, and it made him feel pretty good. Despite this, he also felt a little guilty about double dipping. Hank tried to justify it to himself, making excuses that all seemed to ring hollow. Al and his friends were only doing whatever they were doing at one location, after all. It wasn't like they were using every location that Hank had been to. He was free and clear anyway. All he had to do was say that he had no idea what was going on, and divert attention away from himself. Hell, whatever they were doing at this site was none of his business anyway, right? Despite his reasoning, site number 8 became one of his least favorite stops of the day. With 12 stops, he always spent about 30 minutes to an hour at each, so the inmates could clean up the trash and rake the leaves. From 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. each day, Hank and the guys went from site to site, doing the same thing they did every day. The guys had been doing this long enough that most of them could have the site cleaned in about 20 minutes. But Site 8 was becoming the exception to the rule. Site 8 became a daily chore that Hank wished he could skip. If Hank had been superstitious, he'd have said the site was haunted. It had always taken about 15 to 20 minutes to clean this site in the past, but now it was taking right up to an hour every day, and it seemed to correlate with Jasper making that damn scarecrow. As the inmates worked, Hank saw many of them cast sidelong looks at the thing. On more than one occasion, he saw them stop what they were doing entirely and just look at the scarecrow with rising levels of anger. It was as though it were talking to them, and whatever it was saying, they didn't seem to like it. More than one of them took a step towards it before Jasper would run over and say something to soothe them. They would always go back to work, but Hank was sure that one day they would hear something that would send that scarecrow sailing into the pile too. They weren't the only ones hearing things. Hank usually sat in the cab with the windows down so he could catch a breeze, gas being too expensive to sit with the AC on all day. As he sat there one morning, Hank suddenly heard a weird, whispery voice, and it brought him out of his near doze. He looked up and counted the inmates in a quick sweep of his eyes. He was making sure that no one was close enough to the bus to be heard, and had expected someone to be playing a joke. He was not in a joking mood, and this was something that Hank was prepared to take someone back to prison over. What he found was all 20 of them hard at work. Even Jasper was raking this morning, and none of them were anywhere close to the van. Hank looked back down at his phone, his eyes growing a little heavy again, but his head snapped back up when he heard the same whispery voice crawl across his nerves. He looked around to make sure no one was playing games with him, knowing already that it couldn't have been anyone on his crew. Hank glanced around the truck to make sure that it wasn't an outside party, but there was no one anywhere near the bus. The breeze creaked the scarecrow on his post, and it seemed to him that it was pointed in Hank's direction, the ragged thing seeming to inquire if Hank was looking at him. Hank climbed back into the cab, looking back down at his phone as he tried to drown the sound out with some show or another. He could hear that spidery voice as the opening to Law & Order scrolled severely by, and no amount of volume increase could stop it from rankling his senses. When it whispered again, Hank jumped as though someone was right next to his ear. Hank had thought he heard it plain as day, and the words were low but clear. "He comes." The slamming door turned all the inmates around, Hank's eyes creeping over them accusingly. "Which one of you's doing that?" he yelled, all 20 of them glancing up in confusion. They didn't understand, but when the guy with the shotgun spoke, the masses listened. "Doing what, boss?" Creed finally asked. "Whispering real loud. Whoever's doing it, stop it. It's giving me the creeps." 20 sets of shoulders shrugged in that eerie unison that inmates seemed to possess, and went back to work. The Scarecrow groaned on his post as he observed them, and as Hank returned to the truck, he heard it again. It was plain as day now, and it sounded as though someone was standing right behind him. Hank glanced over his shoulder at the inmates, but they were 30 to 40 feet away. There was no way any of them could have whispered that loud and that clear. He closed the door and settled onto the front seat. The Scarecrow creaked on his post again, snapping Hank's head around to look at him. He saw that all the inmates were watching him, their faces telling him clearly that they were worried about him. He shouted at them to get back to work and rolled the windows up. He sat watching them for a few minutes, just watching them go about their drudgery, and marked each of them. Several of them looked at the Scarecrow as they raked, and Hank could see that the leaves around the raggedy sentry were unraked in a large circle. He felt another urge to tear the thing down and throw it onto the pile, but he squashed it. The Scarecrow was the marker. He needed it to mark the spot where Al was to drop whatever he was dropping. Besides, it's just a Scarecrow. The Green Man comes. He jumped high enough to bash his head on the roof of the bus this time. Hank looked around nervously, but there was no one there. The radio hadn't made a sound all day, and that whispering had been close enough that it might have been coming from lips pressed right against his ear. He rolled down the window and told them to get in the bus because they were moving on. The inmates ran over quickly, looking relieved as they threw their tools in the back and climbed in behind the mesh wire that separated the front of the bus from the back. Hank put the van in drive and they rolled to the next site, leaving the Scarecrow behind with his leaf pile. Hank was never happier to leave a stretch of road behind, and the clamor from the back made him think that he wasn't alone. Hank may have left him, but the Scarecrow didn't seem to be done with him that day. That was the first night he started having the dreams about Site 8. Hank dreamed that he was at the roadside, just him at the site. The light of the moon shone full and pale over him, seeming to leave him in that green guardian in the spotlight. The piles of leaves loomed up 20 times as big as they had before, and the Scarecrow stood before it like a grinning sentry. The pile moved and stirred as something slid beneath the leaves, and Hank could see little humps sliding along the dense foliage. All at once, the pile burst into flames, and from within came the screams of the damned. The humps beneath churned wildly about as the flames licked at the massive mound of dead leaves. The Scarecrow turned on its pole to face him, a wide tear beginning to rip across its mouth. It was as though something was clawing to be free, and it seemed as violent as the creature in the leaf pile. The Scarecrow danced on its pole as its arms waved and flapped in the phantom wind. As the fire backlit the Scarecrow, his mouth came open, and he spread that dark pit that was fit only for terrible things. "He comes! He comes! The Green Man seeks his sacrifice!" the Scarecrow screamed at him. Hank shuffled back a step, seeking escape, when his foot caught on something. He fell hard on his backside as the flames danced higher. Hank could hear the screams take on a tortured, cat-like wail as the flames sent the shadows up behind the pyre. The shadow was monstrous. Its head was a mass of antlers. From the shadowy face, its eyes burned, and its voice rose. Its voice was that of the Headless Horseman when it spoke to Ichabod, the voice of the wolf when it spoke to Little Red Riding Hood, the voice Faust heard just before he was drawn into hell. "I come," it bellowed, and Hank awoke in a cold sweat with the covers constricting him. "Aren't you going to go back to see the Scarecrow?" Jasper asked. Hank ignored him as he drove on to Site 9. He avoided Site 8 for the next 3 days. The inmates didn't seem to mind, all except for Jasper. He would press his face against the window, leaving smudges on the glass as he followed the lonesome Scarecrow with his sad eyes. Every day, he would ask if they were going to Site number 8, and every day Hank would ignore him. The money kept being deposited, despite Hank not going there. The leaves gathered and the trash collected, but no one seemed to notice but Hank. The dreams persisted, though, and Hank was beginning to sleep less and less. He had hoped that maybe avoiding the sight would help him kick the dreams, but it seemed to make them worse. Every night, he would dream about that screaming scarecrow, and every night he would see that horrid monster as it stood behind the fire. Hank had hoped that, after a week of not going to the site, the dreams would finally cease, but it seemed that fate had other ideas. After 5 days, someone noticed his lack of attention. Hank suspected that Jasper had written a grievance about it so that he could take care of that damned scarecrow, but it could have just as easily been a phone call from a concerned citizen. Hank got an email from his boss telling him that Site 8 hadn't been visited in several days, and if he wouldn't go back to it, he would find someone who would. It was 2 weeks from burning day, so it wasn't as though Hank could put it off either. The phone call from Al, however, was far less pleasant. Hank had been keeping the little phone charged, just in case, and when it rang one night, he nearly jumped out of his skin. He was so used to it being silent that when it finally did ring, it was like the family dog talking. Hank picked it up nervously like he thought it might explode, and when he said hello, he heard Al on the other end as he asked what was going on with the drop site. He was clearly smiling as he spoke, but his voice was full of razors. "We've paid you a lot of money, buddy, and you haven't been maintaining the site. A messy site draws attention, and attention is the last thing we want. Understood? I trust you'll stop by tomorrow and ensure that everything is ship-shape. Wouldn't want you to have to know what we've been dumping at that site, now would we?" With that, Al hung up, and Hank began to realize that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. The next day, he was back at Site 8, and Hank was not looking forward to what lay ahead. The inmates were already grumpy about having to do a week's worth of work, and tempers were definitely on edge. The wind was making the scarecrow creak on his pole, and Hank saw more than one of them stop what they were doing to look at him. Jasper was the only one who seemed to want to get close to him. He was plucking at his sleeves and crooning to him as the others worked. The lack of help wasn't going to go over very well, and after an hour of raking and picking up had gone by, Hank saw one of them striding towards the scarecrow with murder in his eyes. Rogers was a big black guy whose prison blues looked painted on him, and his destination was pretty clear. Jasper looked scared as he watched him approach, but Roger knew exactly what he wanted. "No, don't touch him, But Roger cut him off. "I'm tired of that goddamn thing whispering at me. Move, Jasper, I'm throwing this trash on the pile." "No, you can't. He serves the green man. He'll strike you down if you mess with his serf—" Roger threw a right cross that laid Jasper out. But as he gripped the post with the scarecrow on it, Jasper howled and grabbed his leg as he forced him to the ground. The two rolled on the leaves, hitting and kicking, but as they got closer to the main pile, Hank began to get scared that something might be discovered. He reached into the cab and grabbed the shotgun, firing it into the air and bringing them back to their senses. The two stopped fighting immediately, and as Hank walked towards them, they sobered up pretty quick. "That's enough. That's the last straw. Everyone get your asses back in the bus, now!" As they shuffled off towards the van, Hank did what he should have done a week ago. He picked up the scarecrow and threw it into the pile. Jasper cried out harshly from the van, the other inmates restraining him as he tried to rush Hank and get himself good and hurt. The scarecrow landed post down, and when it did, Hank heard the sharp end stick into something meaty. It was a big pile. There was no way he should have been able to hit more than leaves. As the red splatter crept up the post, Hank knew what was being dumped there. When Hank picked up the shotgun and walked back towards the bus, Jasper was laughing in the far back of the van. The others were giving him a wide berth, and Hank couldn't blame them. Hank tried to tune him out, but it was impossible as Jasper kept giggling and gibbering from the back of the van. "His sacrifice lies below the surface. The green man will have his treats this year." Jasper giggled all the way to the next stop, and Hank let him stay on the bus for the rest of the day. That night, the scarecrow was back at his appointed place in Hank's dreams. This time, when the fire was lit and the shadow was cast, Hank could see the caster of it. He was tall, dressed in armor, and his head was christened with a rack of magnificent antlers. He noticed Hank noticing him, and Hank shuddered as his regard fell on him. The creature came towards Hank, and he could hear the scrape of a jagged something as it rasped on the ground behind him. It came forward, raising a massive axe, and just as it loomed over the terrified Hank, ready to bring it down, he woke up. The Scarecrow was back where he had been the next day, the pole still rusty red where it had pierced something in the pile. Jasper was pleased, stroking the Scarecrow and singing to him, but the other inmates seemed as uneasy as Hank was. Who would put it back? Why had they put it back? The more he looked at it, the more Hank thought that the Scarecrow had simply put itself back. It had gone right back into the hole that it had come from, and the more he thought about it, the more Hank thought about the dream he would inevitably have again that night. On that, he was right, but when he awoke from the dream later that night, he didn't wake up in his own bed. Hank woke up and became aware of the cold on his naked chest. His pajama pants were wet, the cuffs clinging to him, and his legs were damp on the back from lying on the ground. He was lying on a bed of leaves, an old newspaper under his head, and when he looked up, he felt his heart skip a beat as he jittered backwards on his hands and feet. Hank was on the side of the road, with the Scarecrow looming over him. He half expected the pile to catch fire and the horned thing to loom over him once again, but when no such combustion occurred, Hank walked home in a daze. It was a long walk, made all the longer by his hurting legs and bleeding feet. It appeared he had walked the 8 miles from his home to here, and his feet had suffered the brunt of the excursion. He got back in his bed just as the sky started to pinken, and 10 minutes later, his alarm blared to life. Hank growled as he slapped it off. Today was not going to be an improvement over the day before. Hank was a zombie at work, and he caught himself napping in the driver's seat more than once. Roger commented that he looked like crap when he'd driven up to pick them up this morning, and Hank said that with the black eye he was sporting, he must be an expert. Hank didn't notice till they got to the first stop of the day that Jasper wasn't there, and when he asked Roger where he was, the big man scoffed. He went crazy last night in the dorm and they locked his ass in confinement. Serves him right. He's been acting crazy ever since they found that damn rag man. Hank nodded, knowing the feeling all too well. He'd been feeling pretty crazy since that Scarecrow had been found too, and Hank had a feeling that his craziness wouldn't be so easily cooled as Jasper's. He woke up underneath the Scarecrow again that night. There was something in his hand this time, and when he looked down, Hank realized that it was a box of matches. They were the big ones from the kitchen, the ones with the fat heads and the long stems. He lit one and watched the way the flames danced against the Scarecrow's fabric. Hank wondered what it would be like to light him on fire, just spark him up and watch him burn. And the want was almost too strong to bear. Instead, he just slipped the matches into his pocket, blew out the lit one, and started his long walk home. He bummed a ride a few minutes later, getting to his house before dawn, but that turned out to be the only bit of luck that day. Hank was having real trouble keeping his eyes open as he sat in the van that day. His body was sore, his legs cramping every time he tried to use them. Hank was barely coherent by this point, but the department was short-handed, and no one had time to listen to his problems. It wasn't as though he had the kind of job you could just take a day off from, and unless Hank wanted to find himself demoted, he would have to be at his post. The saving grace was that tomorrow was Saturday, and the work squad didn't convene on Saturday. Hank would have the next 2 days off, and he could hopefully get some rest before hitting it hard again Monday. He was snoring half an hour later, when the sounds of raised voices brought him around. Roger was face to face with another inmate. Hank thought his name might be Harrow, and the two had a large group gathered around them. Harrow was yelling about Roger not helping, and Roger was yelling about Harrow being an idiot, and how he'd picked up half the trash while Harrow was raking leaves. Hank could see a powder keg getting ready to burst as the Scarecrow looked on in smiling approval, and he climbed out of the bus as he tried to de-escalate the situation. He could have brought the shotgun with him, but he still held out hope that he could stop this before it got out of control. That hope was dashed when the brawl broke out. Men with rakes, men with sticks, and men with nothing but their fists started pummeling each other. Hank was still at the edge of the conflict when it erupted, and he backpedaled like a frightened cat as he ran to the bus to get his radio. He called it in, letting them know that he was safe but the inmates were engaged in a riot. Help was immediately dispatched to his location, but Immediate wasn't quite quick enough. Hank watched a rake slap across someone's face and sent a wash of blood over the burlap sack that was the Scarecrow's head. He saw Roger bash another inmate, not even the one he had started an argument with, across the face with a chunk of deadfall, and they fell in the dirt with blood leaking out of their ears. 2 more were kicking a third to death until a 4th came and slapped one across the back with a rake, leaving a long line of scratches down it. It was hard to look everywhere at once, and as the melee went on, Hank saw the Scarecrow dancing gleefully on his pole. The blood splattered on the ground seemed to please him. Maybe it pleased the Green Man, too, and when the cars finally got there, more than 8 of his men were on the ground and wounded. There were local cops, highway patrol, some of them, and they shouted and waved their guns around until all of them got on the ground and submitted to restraints. When it was all said and done, Hank found himself on probation. It was a wonder he wasn't fired outright, the major told him, and he'd be lucky to go back to work squad at all. "You're slipping. You've been slipping for the past few weeks. Go home and get some rest or something. We'll discuss the terms of your probation tomorrow." Every inmate on his crew was sent to confinement pending discipline, and if Hank was ever allowed to run work squad again, he'd need some new faces. These things had seemed important while they were happening, but they hardly seemed to matter now. As Hank stood on the side of the road in his pajama pants, the can of gasoline in one hand and the book of matches in the other, he realized that nothing would ever matter again. Hank barely remembered the trip. One minute he was stepping out of the shower and slipping on his pajamas. The next, he was in the garage grabbing a can of gas. Hank had a vague memory of walking up the side of the highway as cars droned by, their drivers likely thinking he was crazy. He guessed he must really look nuts, walking up the highway instead of climbing into bed, but Hank had finally given up on what he wanted and decided to give the Scarecrow what it wanted. Hank splashed the gasoline around a little before finally just throwing the can into the pile of leaves. It wasn't as big as it was in his dream, but it was pretty big. Nothing moved below the surface, but Hank thought he could see some weird shapes under the pile as he struck the match and looked into its dancing flames. It was so pretty, so warm, and if Hank looked deep enough, he could almost see someone other than this green man that haunted his dreams and filled his days. He dropped the match, and the gas took flame effortlessly. The whole pile burned cheerily, and when the can erupted suddenly and explosively, the whole mess went up in a huge conflagration. Hank lit his beacon. He could smell his feast cooking. As Hank watched the flames, they seemed to beckon him forward. Hank shivered as the autumn wind glided over his skin. He was cold, but he thought it would be warm in the flames. As the Scarecrow burned happily, his face melting as the flames devoured him, Hank thought he might go find out what that lovely green guardian had discovered in the flames. Hank took a shaky step towards the pyre, preparing to be warm eternally. His name was Eric Jameson, and he saved Stragview from the riot of 2017. Eric Jameson, Officer Jameson, was probably the nicest guy you'd ever meet. He was a career officer, a man who'd forgotten more about corrections than most of us had ever known. His appearance was vaguely Chinese, or maybe Korean. He always wore his hair in one of those buns, his widow's peak never touching the thick gray mane on the top. He always reminded me of Uncle Iroh from Avatar, and the way he spoke and carried himself was very reminiscent of the character. I got to work with him on my first night flying solo on the compound, and it was an experience I wouldn't trade for anything. When you walked with him through the quad, it was as though the clouds lifted away from the sun. Inmates smiled more. Officers were less surly. Everyone was just in a better mood when Jameson was around. He was personable, remembering inmates' names and asking about their troubles. He passed 5 times as much time in the quad as any other officer I'd ever known, a practice that would have gotten anyone but Jameson dragged into the investigator's office under speculation of inmate collusion. Jameson did the same to his fellow officers, though, and I never saw anyone snap or take a surly tone with Jameson. He was knowledgeable, sharing his wisdom willingly, and the way he walked amongst his charges was utterly devoid of fear or care. He walked through the quad as though it were his home, and the inmates were no more than his neighbors, whom he was greeting on his way home from work. This was not a skill he had gained from years of experience, though. Jameson had a way about him, that was undeniable. Jameson had a vibration about him that broke up tension. It was an ability you had to see firsthand. It was an ability I actually got to see firsthand. About a year after I started with the department, we had a significant disturbance in F dorm. What had started as a skirmish between rival gangs had developed into a fight that threatened to bathe the whole quad in blood. It all came to a head at lunchtime. The two gangs had taken advantage of the other inmates leaving and took the opportunity to privately air their grievances. We were all poised to roll into the dorm with force. Blood and weapons were already present in the quad when Jameson stepped into the corridor. The captain had just finished up a blistering speech designed to prep us for the coming scuffle when Jameson walked through the door and stepped inside. 20 or so men looked at him, their faces covered in a veneer of readiness, and their resolve melted away before we could take a single step towards the door. He spoke to the two groups for less than a minute before both were ready to end the hostilities and submit to the officers in the hallway. Jameson came out of the quad with a peaceful smile stretched across his old young face. "They're ready to comply, Captain," he said, his voice like a gentle river. That was when I felt it. It was like someone hit a tuning fork. You can feel it vibrate through your skin, in your teeth, in your gray matter as it washes over you. This was like that, except it was more like a gentle wind chime or a soft temple bell. I saw it wash over the others in the hall as well, and a general atmosphere of calm permeated everyone. Even the captain, who had been ready to spit nails when Jameson had walked onto the quad, smiled and clapped the grandfatherly fellow on the shoulder as he admonished him for his efforts. I saw Jameson later as he came out of the area next to the captain's office that held the snack machines, and I asked him about it. He just smiled. "Oh, just years of know-how. It's all about knowing how to say and when to say it. You'll pick it up, little brother." I shook my head, my body wanting to smile and agree with him as his proximity made me feel easy again. "No, I mean, the thing that happened when you talked in the hallway. I heard a kind of a chime?" I tried lamely. I couldn't properly describe the emotion because it wasn't something I'd ever felt before. The others seemed to accept it, almost seemed to welcome the feeling of ease that wafted around Jameson like a fog. I, on the other hand, wanted some answers. I wasn't one to just accept things as they were, and I hoped this was something he was aware of. If it wasn't, I was about to sound very crazy to someone that I respected. Jameson smiled, chuckling a little in the face of my confusion. "You're a little more pragmatic than the others, I see. Yes, I suppose you'd call it a tone. Since I was young, I've had it. A kind of aura that creates peaceful feelings in those around me. It's a gift I often use around here." I was astonished. "You mean you have this gift for bringing peace to those around you, and you use it in a prison?" He took a chip from the bag and chewed it speculatively, as though thinking about how he would answer the question. "When I was 13, I thought I might use the ability to become a diplomat or a politician. If I could bring peace to those around me, I could be an asset to those in trying situations. I soon realized, though, that positions like that were out of the reach of my less-than-rich family. I thought then about training to be an actor, someone who could affect change by the nature of celebrity. That was another path that was closed to me, however. The climate at that time was not kind to Asian immigrants, even those not hailing from Japan. I then considered the army. Maybe I could do some good as an officer, and someone with my skill set would be useful on the battlefield. The Vietnam War was raging, and it was far better to enlist than to be drafted. I joined and served my time, but I never made it onto the battlefield. Instead, I was sent to a Navy vessel and told to cook, something I was good at. I slung hash for the next 8 years and retired with a pension, and an unfulfilled ideal. As he told me his tale, I could almost imagine the younger man he had been. He had been full of ideas and hopes, just like me, and he felt dissatisfied by the world at large. He had a talent, but the world didn't see fit to use that talent. Sometimes it seems like the world makes things harder for itself. I confided in an officer while aboard the USS Copeland that I had a gift for making people calm. He laughed until I proved it by calming a group of tired flightmen who were milling about the landing zone. They went from scowling and mumbling to smiling and going about their task with purpose within a second of me talking to them. He asked how this could be possible, and I told him about my strange aura. The officer, however, told me it might be best to keep this ability to myself. I would likely be thrown out as a loony, or worse, kept in a lab somewhere and experimented on by people who believed me. He sighed and seemed to stare off into space, reliving his glory days. So there I was, 26, unemployed, and looking for the next place to use my talents. I considered a career in medicine, but I didn't have the memory or the stomach for it. I considered law enforcement, but my academy scores were never good enough to qualify. Corrections, on the other hand, decided that they would take me gladly. That was back in '76, and a man with no family and an open schedule can find all sorts of work in this department. I signed on with Stragview, and I've been here for nearly 30 years. Yeah, but why? I cut in. Jameson looked across the yard, taking in the dorms and the chain link, and seemed to miss it already. Did you know that while I've been here, uses of force have declined by 45% from the year previous to my hiring? When I'm on shift, the need for physical force is at an all-time low. This prison sits on a nexus, son. I'm sure you've noticed some strange things around here. As he said it, his eyes twinkled a little in the moonlight. Thinking back on it, I had indeed seen some strange things within the walls of Stragview. Sometimes, some unexplainable things. If my presence here can cause even one officer to leave in his car as opposed to in an ambulance, then my time here has been well spent. I do not consider my talents squandered. Quite the contrary. I think this is where they might be best served. I always found that profound when I looked back on it. I did, before that night at least. 6 months ago, Officer Jameson told me that he was retiring. I was working inside at this point. The captain liked to have me on his yard team, and I liked being a part of it. I was going to pick up his count slips when he gave me the good news. Next month will mark my 30 years of service with the department. After 30 years, I think I might be ready for some much overdue rest. I asked him how he meant to spend his retirement, and he told me about a piece of property he owned with a fish pond and a hunting lease. He intended to hunt, to fish, to care for his garden, and maybe even write his memoirs about his time in the war and his time with DOC. He seemed happy when he spoke about these things, and I was happy for him. He seemed pleased at the prospect of rest, and I wished him joy of his newfound freedom. By the end of the month, he was gone, and we settled into life without Jameson at Stragview Prison. When I arrived at work the next day, the change was immediate. The air around Stragview had always been heavy. The place seemed almost Lovecraftian at times, and an air of oppression seemed to roll in with the fog most mornings. Today, though, it seemed different. It felt like it might rain at any minute, and it was the first time I had ever thought about just climbing back into my truck and driving home. We used force that night. It was the ugly kind of force, the kind you use on desperate men. His name was Daffin, and it all started because he was hungry. Like many inmates, Daffin decided to sneak a second tray from the food line. Officer Wilde stopped him on the way through the chow hall and told him to give up the tray. Inmate Daffin explained that he had paid for this extra tray, not uncommon in prison economics, but Wilde was hearing none of it. He snatched the tray and told Daffin to take his ass to his table and not to treat him like some rookie. Daffin responded by punching Officer Wilde in the face. Officer Wilde responded by breaking his jaw and nearly kicking off the first chow hall riot I had ever seen. We got them calmed down, and Daffin went to the infirmary while Wilde went home. I had seen violence on the compound before, but this was the closest I'd ever seen to it coming off the rails. Tensions remained high for the rest of the night, but I would soon discover that the chow hall incident was just an overture. The week after that, the outbreak started. The previous week had been hard. 4 stabbings, 3 fights, 3 assaults on staff, and 2 attempted suicides had made it the longest week I could remember. Daffin had gone to the hospital in the midst of it, his jaw re-breaking when he tried to break up one of the fights. And when they called me in on Monday, my first day off, I was not happy. I wasn't alone though. Most of my shift was called in to lock down 2 of our open bay dorms. Daffin had come back from the hospital with something, and it was spreading like wildfire. We were never sure if it was the flu or what exactly it was, but it made them cough and snot and acted more like pneumonia than anything. After the 5th inmate had been rushed to the hospital, they put another dorm on lockdown. After the first death, they put nearly all the dorms on lockdown. The only 2 dorms not on lockdown by the end of the month were H and F. This was only because they were under too high a custody to get close to the infected inmates, which worked against them this time. They became responsible for cooking the meals, packed in styrofoam, and trucked down to the dorms. These were men with no experience in the kitchen, and as the quality of the food began to slip, the quarantine dorms began to make more and more noise. We were living in a powder keg, and a single spark would be all it would take to blow us all to kingdom come. That spark came on the night of the riot. I had just got on shift when the call about a fight came down. 2 officers from the previous shift were sent to help the dorm officer quell the disturbance. After I got my equipment, I headed that way to see if they needed help. When the siren went off, I knew something terrible had gone down. I could see the doors of the dorm, and the inmates were pressed against them as the maglocks held them in place. The officers in the station had been quick enough to engage the security locks, and I could see Creased glancing over his shoulder as he shunted an inmate away from the dorm. You could hear the blatting siren from halfway across the world, so when we got the word that F dorm was in an uproar, we weren't terribly surprised. When they came boiling out of the side doors like angry cockroaches, that did surprise us a little. We'd been suited up for a breach, preparing to enter the side doors of H dorm and rescue a wounded officer. The 6 of us were preparing to enter when a mob of howling inmates came spilling down the lawn. We would later find out that they had somehow gained access to the station and took the door off its lockdown. At that moment, though, all we could do was fall back for the gate and try to quell the tide. We spent the better part of the night holding the center gate. The inmates would push to the gate, attempt to rush us, and fall back after we put a few of them down. Killing isn't something you know you can do until you've had to do it, and the sight of these men sprawled out on the grass still haunts me a little. Our usual team, a 6-man group that joked and laughed through our weekly drills, were not toting empty guns tonight. Every weapon had lethal ammunition, and our goal seemed to be more than the usual rescue the CO and quell the inmates scenario. We had put down another 6 when someone came to relieve another officer named Hardy and I. The 2 of us were taken to the warden's office, where he sat drinking tea as though this were just another day. The warden looked well put together for someone awake in the dead of night. His pinstripes were immaculate, his salt and pepper hair was uniform, and his gold-rimmed glasses were polished to a high gloss. He smiled at us, wolfishly, as we entered, and the smile was wide and toothy. I suddenly had a bad feeling that we were about to be called upon to do something not altogether legal. I didn't like the warden much. I had only seen him a few times, and every time he had made my stomach turn over. During my interview, as the assistant warden and the captain of my prospective shift had asked me questions, he had just sat there, staring at me. His eyes were predatory, calculating, and it was easy to imagine that he could see right through you as his eyes bore into your very soul. He had interrupted the assistant warden mid-question to tell him that I had the job, and it had taken everything in my power to reach across and shake that hand. Now I wish I'd never taken the job.
I need you boys to go on a little errand for me, he said, glancing over the rim of his cup like a mischievous cat. I almost fancied that his eyes changed as he spoke. He gave us directions and sent us out in a state van. As I rode shotgun, I wasn't happy about what we'd been told to do. The warden wanted us to go to an address and pick up a CO who would help us with our current situation. The CO in question was known to all of us. He had been on our shift until just last month. The general tremors around the compound have changed drastically since he left. We need a man of his talents back at work where he belongs, the warden had said. We were going to rouse Jameson from his much-deserved rest. The whole trip I felt very conflicted about this little errand. Jameson had earned the right to his rest, and we were going to drag him back to a place he had only recently escaped. Sometimes I joked with certain inmates that I had another 27 years before my release date, and I was doing a 30-year stint myself. This made me wonder if, at the end of the day, would they be free to pull me back too? I didn't like the idea of that. We pulled up in front of the house around 3 a.m. and found him waiting on the front porch. He had put his uniform back on, his hair scooped into its typical warrior's knot, and he looked utterly at peace. I could feel his tone when I climbed out of the van, a calming breeze that blew across my face. But as we approached, I began to feel a strangeness amongst the notes, a discord that pervaded the tone. He was presenting it for us, but was far from committed to the feeling. Sergeant Hardy, to what do I owe the pleasure of your company so early in the morning? Hardy paused for a moment and pressed on. I assume that you know, dressed as you are. I think you were waiting for us, maybe. Jameson nodded placidly. Maybe. Maybe I woke up and sensed that my gifts were needed. Regardless, I am ready. He sat in the back, and I chose to sit with him as Hardy drove. I felt less and less sure about this errand the longer it went on. It almost felt like we were escorting this man to his incarceration, if not his execution. He sat smiling, looking straight ahead as Hardy drove, and I found myself staring at him with ill ease. He turned his smiling eyes to me, and my unease deepened. He looked like a man whose mind is at peace with his own death. "What's on your mind, son?" he asked. I shook my head. I just don't feel good about what we're doing. It feels wrong. Suddenly I was assaulted by his calming aura, and it washed over me like a warm bath. All will be fine. All is as it should be. He gripped my hand and squeezed, and I felt at peace all the way back to the compound. We arrived to find the National Guard vehicles in the parking lot. They had finally arrived, it seemed, and were preparing to go inside and gain control. We rolled through the front gate onto the compound, taking Jameson in through the front gate entrance. He climbed out of the back, looking around with a sense of homecoming, and we made our way to the center gate. Jameson floated between us, the picture of composure, but those jangles were still present amongst the calming aura he exuded. We led him, Hardy and I on either side of him, but it was he who truly led us. When we approached the line at the gate, the captain nodded at Jameson. His look was full of something, but at the time I couldn't place it. Jameson patted his shoulder and stepped towards the mass of inmates keeping a muddled perimeter near the gate, just outside of shotgun range. "Jameson, what are you doing?" I called out, stepping towards him. "They'll tear you apart." The captain stopped me with an outstretched hand. Let him work. This ain't his first rodeo. The inmates noticed him and began to move towards him like a swarm of angry bees. He didn't falter in his course, never wavered, but as he neared, I felt him reach out with that odd tone and give them the full brunt of his power. They charged him, raising clubs and shanks, but staggered as they came within 10 feet of the man. They began to sway, began to fall, and as I watched, they all fell on their faces in the grass and placed their hands behind their backs. They fell like cordwood, weapons spilling from limp fingers as they lay smiling on the grass in placid compliance. It was at that moment that I understood the terrifying extent of Jameson's power. It was then that I understood why he had never been allowed to be a general or a politician, or a diplomat, or anything more than a minder of the dregs of society. Had Jameson been a very different man, he could have used his power to devastating effects. There was no way that a just and loving God would have allowed a man to be tested so, without corruption. We spent the next hour putting zip cuffs on inmates as Jameson moved across the compound. We couldn't take him into the dorms, of course. We couldn't risk such a weapon in the confined space behind the doors, but it seemed we didn't have to. Just his presence on the yard quelled much of the riots, and we began to receive reports of inmates throwing down their weapons and returning to compliance. As Jameson walked, order began to reassert itself. As Jameson went, so peace went in his wake. He saved us from the riot that would have taken days to quell. He saved hundreds of lives. And how did we repay him? We were on the rec yard when it happened. We had cuffed them and were processing inmates on the yard as they tried to regain some normalcy. We identified the instigators, threw the others back in their dorm, and the light of dawn was just beginning to peek above the horizon. The warden had come out with an armed escort and was overseeing the operation with the captain, Hardy, and myself. Jameson was continuing to calm the situation, his tone stretching out like an ocean wave, and when he ambled over to our group, he was haggard but smiling. It had taken something out of him to use it, and he looked ready to drop. The warden extended a hand to Jameson, and he looked at it hesitantly before he shook it. "Excellent work, Jameson. We've missed your little gift around here. How would you like to come back? I can see that you're promoted, move to admin shift, and put you up somewhere cozy." Jameson smiled, but shook his head. "I do not think so, sir. I'm willing to lend my gift now and again, but I've found that I quite like retirement." The warden feigned a look of regret. "I was afraid you'd say that." The captain's shotgun stock cracked against the back of Jameson's head, and he fell face first onto the grass. I had my gun slung around and pointed at them before I could stop myself. The captain swung the barrel of his shotgun around to cover me, but the warden shoved it away and stepped between my gun barrel and the group. His eyes did that funny thing again, where they shifted to something almost cat-like. He didn't look angry or afraid, but was instead curious as he studied me with his strange eyes. "You know what must be done. If he leaves the compound, it will descend back into chaos. So, he mustn't be allowed to leave. You know this is the best thing for the prison. A little sacrifice for the good of us all." I pointed the gun at them, wanting to pull the trigger. If I did, though, I'd have to pull it on myself next. I'd known what would happen here. Hadn't I felt it at the beginning? The gun held firm for a count of 10, the warden standing between us, the captain looking nervous, Hardy's eyes darting for the best course of escape. Eventually, I dropped my gun barrel and let it hang underneath my arm. The warden said to grab him, so we did. We took him through the rec office and down a flight of stairs I had never seen before. We came to a door, a big ugly metal thing, that opened onto a shadowy corridor that seemed to stretch into the earth. It was lit by a small island of light created by overhead lights in small round cages. As we walked, a chorus of the damned yelled from the doors. They wanted food, they wanted freedom, they wanted death, they wanted to see the sun. We ignored them, and many shrank away when they saw that the warden was with us. We deposited Jameson into one of those cells. He lay on the floor, breathing shallowly, and I paused at the door to look at him. Were we really about to do this? Were we really going to doom a man to spend his days in this dark hole? Would his gift even reach out from this hellish place? As the door swung shut, I both hoped it would and prayed that it wouldn't. That was a month ago, and the prison has never been more peaceful. In the wake of the riot, we returned to the same semblance of peace, much like the days before the quarantine. But I know the truth. I've thought about quitting 1,000 times, thought about putting my gun in my mouth and ending it all, but I always worry that I too might wake up in that lightless void beneath the prison. So let us never forget Officer Jameson, the savior of our compound. May his death come swiftly and release him from the hell he now resides in.
I've been working on the Stragview work squad for about a year. Working is the best way to make the time go by. At least that's what I thought. Before I'd been arrested for aggravated assault, I was a landscaper's assistant. I ran the mower, cut the bushes, moved mulch and sod in the hot sun for some fat cat client that had money to pay for landscapers, and if it hadn't been for the bar fight, I'd have probably gone right on doing that for the next 20 years until I finally blew my brains out. Now I get to do it for the next 5 years until I'm up for parole. If I live that long, I guess. Stragview's a big old prison that's been around since, I don't know, the turn of the century, I guess. It's split into 2 sections, the outer ward and the inner ward. The 2 are separated by a gate called the center gate, and the traffic between is heavily monitored. The inner ward is for housing. It holds 5 open bay dorms that look like big old summer camp cabins. They house around 100 guys and hold a series of bunk beds for them to sleep on. Next are the 2 big concrete block buildings that house the close management guys, 2-man cells and a series of 40-man quads. Amongst it all sits the foreboding concrete and steel edifice that hunkers behind the barbed wire fence and has the unfortunate luck of being Stragview's confinement unit, and also the J-Dorm death house. Aside from some officers and the canteen buildings that serve as our source of junk food, the rest is just grass and sand and concrete paths. That's a lot of grass to cut in the summer, and a lot of places for snow to blow in the winter. The outer ward, which lies behind the center gate, are the buildings that often serve as job sites. The chow hall, the medical pavilion, the classrooms, the libraries, and the security buildings are mostly concrete sidewalks. They don't require much work from my squad. These are places that are frequented by admins and are usually best avoided if you can help it. The majority of our work takes place inside the center gate. We were all sitting on the north pavilion by E-Dorm, drinking sodas and eating snacks, when the officer in charge of our squad came walking up. Sergeant Henderson was one of the best squad officers I'd ever had. He's not too strict, but he's not too lazy either. Something which tends to get us yelled at by the major sometimes. He was fair to us, and that made all the difference for men trapped behind the fence. He looked kind of worried as he came towards us, and Darius, one of the other guys on the squad, elbowed me and shook his head. "Sarge don't look happy about something. This does not bode well for us." How right he was. "Listen up, guys. Word from the warden just came down. He wants you guys to clean out the tower before quitting time today." We all groaned. The tower was a crumbling concrete behemoth that stood in the dead center of the inner ward. It had existed since the early days of the prison, but was now a derelict monstrosity that officers used to house broken furniture and old records. The place was also crawling with rats, and they were supposed to be territorial as all hell. Inmates did not stray too close to the tower if they could help it. The rats would pop out and bite your ankles or chase you away if you lingered too long. There were stories of them killing people and dragging the bodies off to be eaten, but that was just talk. Every few months we spread poison around the base of the tower, or sprayed harsh chemicals to keep them from coming out, but that was about all the prison did to curb their advance. No one dared to go inside, and anything that needed to be stored in there was done so before sundown. None of us wanted to go to the tower, but the order had been given, and to refuse would be an easy way to get sent to confinement. We took all due precautions before going inside. The shed we kept our stuff in had thick rubber boots and gloves, ventilators, and leather smocks that we used when hacking down thick weeds or clearing brush that might have snakes in it. The get-up was like to be hot. The tower had no AC after all. By the time Henderson called it quits, we were sure to be covered in sweat and tired to the bone. But at least work squad paid well, $1 an hour up to 12 hours, and we'd be able to buy something nice at the canteen when we were done. The 6 of us trudged off to the tower just before lunch was called. The line of inmates walking to the chow hall jeered at us as we walked. They called us dead men walking and rat chow, as it was pretty obvious where we were going. They joked about us feeding the rats, but I could tell that they were relieved too. They were relieved that it wasn't them. They were relieved that they weren't the ones that were going to have to go into that spooky old tower. The tower held an almost legendary status in their minds, and it was definitely better us than them that had to go into it. Before we knew it, we were standing in its shadow. The tower stood about 5 stories tall, roughly 50 feet. It was really only a ground floor and a top deck for observation, but the inside was a tall expanse of empty space. From the top, I figured you could see the whole compound, but I'd never been up there. When the prison was founded, this is where the riflemen stood and watched all the ants on the ground for signs of trouble. Now it was just a relic, something that reminded people of the good old days, and a home for the multitude of rats that lived here. The darkness was heavy and oppressive when we walked inside. The sun fought to find its way through the dusty windows, but found itself unable to pierce the decades of caked-on grime. Sarge flipped a switch next to the door, and the overhead lights came on for a second with a single buzz. It shone for about maybe 20 seconds before exploding in a shower of sparks and glass. The room was once again bathed in darkness, and the light coming through the door seemed unwelcome in that menacing place. We could already hear things moving around in the miasma of broken junk. The skittering and chittering of many mouths that swirled around us was a little unnerving, but we started dragging the closest stuff to the door out as Sarge called for someone to bring some standing lights. It was mostly desks and heavy furniture that had just been left to fall apart. As we moved in, I could already feel the sweltering heat sinking in. The furniture began to pile up outside, and as the lunch crowd filtered back to the dorm, we were all plastered with sweat and huffing on the lawn. Sergeant Henderson looked none too comfortable either. His uniform shirt clung to him, and he tried not to let the sweat stains show under his arms as he pressed his hands into his pockets. When the lights finally arrived, so did a tractor with a trailer. The desks began to be hauled away so they could be burned in the incinerator. Some of the desks seemed to be okay, but most of them were ruined. They were broken, some split along the legs, and others bowed and sagging under years of use. It was clear that some had been in much better shape when they had gone into the tower, but the legs had been chewed and the tops were covered in rat piss and droppings, both old and new. As they came into the sun, you could see the slimy leavings all across the desk simulated wood top, and I felt gross even through my gloves. The number of saved desks were minimal. Most seemed destined for the incinerator. With the lights set up and bathing the inside in a hazy glow, we began to work deeper into the tower. The deeper we went, the more rats we found. Under every shadowy crevice and in every yawning drawer, there was a little cluster of them waiting to be discovered. They weren't horror movie rats, but it's pretty startling when something comes jumping out at you in the dark when you least expect it. As we moved the desks, we broke up their nests. Their nests were little collections of paper and wood that housed families of rats just waiting to be discovered. They came hissing out at us and slapped across our aprons and ankles like furry bullets. The thick gloves we had kept them from biting us, but they still fastened onto our hands and had to be shaken loose. Just the act of being bitten was horrific, and several of the guys started to refuse to go back in after the first hour. The mixture of hazy dark and loud angry animals was putting them on edge. It took all of Henderson's interpersonal skills to keep us working. Even so, there were mutinous whispers the whole time. Slowly but surely, we got the floor cleared. As the furniture began to disappear, the rats started to flee. They ran out the front door and ran up the stairs to the top of the tower, even squeezing through the crumbling floorboards and disappearing into the foundation. After a particularly fat rat wiggled through the boards, I bent and peeked through the slats into the inky blackness. I couldn't see much. It was as black as pitch down there. What I thought I saw was something that reminded me of water. I heard the current of wrestling feet, and as I stood back up, I tried not to think about it as I moved soggy cartons and threw them onto the pile of trash. A river of rats, an ever-flowing stream of black-furred bodies. Flowing where exactly? I wish I'd remained ignorant. It all started when Sam went missing. Sam was a big guy, simple but strong, and he'd been moving around like a tractor in low gear all day. The big blonde farm boy had been moving desks with ease, laughing when the rats had bitten at him and throwing them against the wall with relish. In prison for an assault, like I was, he had grown up on a farm. Rats were probably no more bother to him than a fly. I was moving a big old heavy desk made of genuine mahogany when Darius stepped on a rat. He yelped just as the rat squealed pitifully, and he tripped backwards. When he went down, the leg of the desk snapped as it crashed against the floor, and the desk fell onto his leg. The crunch was audible, and he started screaming almost immediately. I tried to get the desk off him, and it took 3 of the others to finally get it to the side. His leg was a bruised mass of purple flesh, the bone clearly broken. Henderson came running over and swore loudly when he saw the leg. Medical was radioed, but no nurse would willingly set foot in the tower. In the end, Wilbur and Reggie lifted him onto an old canvas stretcher that had been pushed into the corner, and they took him to medical, Henderson already in tow. He stopped just long enough to lock the gate and told Clive and I to stay on the lawn until he returned. Then he huffed down the sidewalk as Darius screamed and the other two tried not to jounce him. That left Clive and me standing on the lawn in the tower's shadow, sweltering in the sun as we baked in our leather aprons and rubber gloves. That was when I realized that Sam was missing. "Hey, where'd Sam go?" I asked, no one in particular, looking around curiously. Clive only shrugged at my question, leaning against the tower and basking in the shade. He was an older guy, about 50, and he had been with the work squad the longest. He acted as a straw boss most of the time, something we let him get away with because of his age. Today, I really wished he had helped take Darius to medical and left someone else to sit here with me. The guy was worse than useless, and before my eyes, I watched him fall asleep in the warm shadow of the tower. I started looking for Sam, walking around the tower to see if maybe Sam had decided to nap somewhere outside as well. A quick trip around the base told me that he wasn't there. I turned to the front lawn, Clive still snoring comfortably, and looked at the gaping maw of the tower. He was still inside, but I didn't see how that was possible. He would have heard Henderson calling everyone out. He certainly hadn't decided to take a nap in there. That would have been a death sentence. The longer I stood there, the more I knew I'd have to go inside. I took a hesitant step, growing bolder as I approached the door. It yawned like a mouth, the darkness unaffected by the daylight that held sway outside. I stuck my head in first, looking around the now clear floor and seeing no one. I glanced up at the spiral staircase that led to the upper observation area. I doubted he had gone up there. That was out of bounds, and Sam wasn't prone to rule breaking like that. That's when I saw the rubber boot silhouette in the harsh halogen lights. It was laid on its side, moving ever so slightly, the owner hidden behind a small collection of desks still to be moved. I couldn't believe it. Sam was sleeping in here with all these rats. I knew he was a big dumb farm kid, but that sounded like a great way to get chewed on. I walked over to the desk, ready to wake him up and drag him out onto the lawn, but I recoiled in horror as I looked over that desk. The green rubber boot had a leg in it that had been severed at the knee. I fell back against the wooden planks as I stumbled, and when my arm went through the rotted flooring, I felt wiry fur and then hard ground. Something bit my arm, and I pulled it free with a little jerk. The ground beneath the floor was dirty, covered in rat droppings and crunchy from old rat bodies. As I watched, I saw a flurry of rat bodies come scuttling past the opening. There wasn't much room beneath the boards, but the skittering masses didn't seem to need much. Then a dragging sound drew my attention back to the leg that was behind the desk. As I watched, I could see it disappear around the corner of the desk. I sprang up. The idea of rats dragging what was left of him down into the earth was appalling. I sprang over the desk to chase it away, coming over in a rush. What I found was an absolutely huge rat dragging the leg away. It reared up at me as big as a good-sized cat, and I backed away hesitantly as I assessed my stance. I reached for a broken-off 2x4, laid across the desk, and swung it at the bristling creature. It ran then, tail bobbing, dropping the leg as it ran for whatever hole it had come out of. That was when my cockiness got the better of me. I ran after the rat, brandishing the chunk of wood and chasing it as it fled in terror. I heard his smaller cousins running as well, and I swung the piece of wood around my head as I whooped and galloped around. They had been a constant terror this whole afternoon, and now I was getting some much-needed revenge. I should have counted my losses and went back outside. I would soon wish I had called in sick that day and just stayed in my bunk. When my foot sank into the wood this time, I tried to pull it out and give chase. Instead, it sank up to the thigh, and I was left squirming to try and get it loose. The big rat stopped running and turned to appraise me with its beady eyes. I swung the wood in his direction, but he was out of range, and he knew it. I squirmed and struggled, trying to get myself free, but when I heard the wood splintering, it didn't register right away. It wasn't until I was falling that it sank home how much trouble I was in. I was in free fall for a few seconds. The air dragged out of me as I plummeted into the darkness. When I hit the stone wall and some ancient chute, I felt my back being scraped as I smacked against it again and again. The wood tumbled out of my hand, and after 30 seconds of falling, I worried I would simply fall forever. Like Alice down the rabbit hole, I would fall until I found the floor. Unlike Alice, I would likely not survive the fall once the floor found me. I landed on something soft about 5 seconds later. It knocked all the wind out of me when I landed, and the sharp little spurs poked into my skin. I could feel blood oozing from the wounds, but they didn't seem to be too bad. My legs still worked, my arms too, and as whatever I had landed on began to wiggle, I rolled onto the floor. I assumed I had landed on a rat warren. The spiky barbs must be wood they had scavenged for their home, but when I rolled off, I quickly scrambled away when I saw what I had landed on. The light from above fell on a massive rat, as long as a sofa and just as big. It lay wheezing in its final moments, its body pulped and mushed. I had broken its bones when I landed on it, and its black and gray fur was riddled with bone spurs that had popped free. Its single piss-yellow eye rolled to meet mine, and I could see its profound confusion as it breathed its last ragged breaths. I took a shaky step back, still transfixed by its staring eyes, and that's when I started to hear the scuttling of many feet across the stone floor. I turned to the nearest tunnel and ran, not wanting to see what other horrors lived down here. I ran through the dark pretty much at random. The tunnels were pitch black as I put the light from the first room behind me. But I had a small lighter, and I used it to see my way. I had survived the fall somehow, and I held my hands in front of me as I ran to not put it out. I became aware of a strange scraping noise from up ahead. It sounded like hundreds of claws scrabbling on the stone, and I knew at once that I did not want to see what was making that noise. The tunnel left me few options, though, and I knew what lay behind me if I turned back. The sound got louder as I walked towards it. The floor became slippery the further I went, and my feet crunched as they came down on something brittle strewn across the floor. A flick of my lighter revealed small animal bones, probably rats, and some of the skulls were big enough to have been large dogs. As for the sudden wetness, I couldn't tell, but the terrible smell that accompanied it made me not want to investigate too closely. I came out of the tunnel and into a towering cave a moment later, and that was when I found the source. The lighter dropped out of my numb fingers, but I had seen all I needed to see in the flickering illumination. I crouched down, hands scrabbling, hoping beyond hope that whatever it was hadn't seen me. I knew it had, though. In that lightless place, I might as well have been carrying a bonfire. I could see its thousands of eyes glaring at me in the darkness. Their hate was enough to freeze me in my tracks. The Leviathan despised me, despised the intruder into its kingdom. As I searched for the lighter, I could hear it scrabbling on thousands of feet towards me as it moved its bulk across the floor. When I was little, I had an uncle who'd been an exterminator. One night while he was babysitting my brother and I, he had told us a story about something called a Rat King. Not some prissy mouse with a crown like we'd seen in the Christmas play either. This was a group of rats whose tails had become hopelessly entangled to the point where they couldn't escape each other unless they chew their own tails off. He had spoken of dozens, maybe even 30 rats strung together in a writhing mass. He had told us about a collection of creatures that had become one creature, living as a symbiotic mass. I remember my brother and I sitting in awe of such a beast as we tried to imagine what it would look like. As I found and sparked the lighter again, I saw the mass of rats. There were hundreds of thousands of them, many the size of mastiffs, with their tails coiled like ropes. The one at the center, though, was an absolute beast. He stood at their core, eyes like semi-truck headlights, big as a small elephant, and his hissing cry sent shivers down my spine. He was at their center, their tails wound to him, and despite his size, I realized he was too massive to move without their collective legs. As the flame came to life again, I realized how close they were and took a step away. They shied away from me, their sensitive eyes dazzled by the sudden intrusion of light, and their shrieks were enough to drive me mad. As they fled, backpedaling on their thousands of legs, I caught a glimpse of another tunnel that snaked out from behind them. I didn't know if that tunnel led to freedom or to a fate worse than this, but I didn't care at that moment. As the massive Rat King floundered backwards, I sprinted for the tunnel and didn't look back as I ran through the blackness. I hit a wall, but just rolled and kept running. I knew what was behind me, and it had to be worse than what lay ahead. I was still running when I saw the daylight ahead of me. I had been running flat out for what felt like hours, and as my eyes registered the return of some kind of light, I kept right on running.
The air became less oppressive, my eyes adjusting to the light's return, and I stopped suddenly as late afternoon greeted me from the mouth of a small cave. I moved out cautiously, and it was a good thing I did. I was soon looking out over a precipice that looked down into the old gravel pit the prison had operated at some time. I had to be a mile or more outside the fence, bruised and bloody and bone-tired. I considered sleeping there until morning. One look back made me think better of it, though. I climbed to the top of the pit, no easy feat, and walked back to the perimeter fence. A post vehicle stopped me, an old hatchet-faced sergeant pointing his gun at me as I tried to explain what had happened. He zip-tied my hands and put me in the bed of his truck, driving me back to the prison's front gate as he called in to find out some information from the control room. When I was pulled out by a couple of unhappy officers, they led me straight to the security building, saying someone wanted to talk to me. I had expected that I would be punished, that I would be charged with escape, that I would be transferred to another facility or sent to confinement. I never expected to be taken to the warden's office. It was well after dark when they sat me down, but the warden looked resplendent in his usual pinstripe suit and little gold-rimmed glasses. The guards unshackled me as they sat me down and then simply left me alone with him. He slid a cup of something hot to me, and I drank the coffee happily. It tasted heavenly after walking through the cold, and he let me get halfway through the cup before he spoke. The warden was one of the odder characters at Stragview. He had been the warden for as long as anyone could remember. He had a mysterious way about him that made inmates uncomfortable. No inmate wanted to speak with him, not even the new ones, and he had never once been attacked or accosted in the whole time he was with the department. "So, I understand you've had quite a trying day," he said with a smile. I nodded, still sipping at the coffee. "So how is it that you came to be outside the fence?" I told him about my fall through the floor of the tower, how I had seen the rats in the tunnel, how I had run through the tunnels to escape them. I felt my hands shake as I told him, and I was afraid that I might spill the coffee on his carpet. As I spoke, he leaned forward and stared at me over the rims of those gold little glasses. He was interested, very interested, and when I glanced over the part about the Rat King, he leaned back and seemed to look disappointed. "I could give you an extra 5 years for escaping. You know that. An extra 5 years can seem like a lifetime to a man inside." I saw a drop of coffee fall to the carpet and tried to steady my hands. Surely he couldn't give me more time for falling into a hole. "But I'll spare you from such a thing if you answer one question for me. One question, and you may return back to your dorm and serve the rest of your sentence in peace." I looked into his eyes, those strange amber orbs that seemed like no eyes I'd ever seen, waiting for the question. He leaned across the desk, anticipation clear on his face. "Did you see him?" I didn't have to ask who he meant. I nodded. He smiled, and his shark's grin was more unsettling than the giant rat thing had ever been. They took me back to my dorm, and I dropped onto my bunk without a word. My fellow work squad members tried to get my attention, wanting to know where I had been, wanting to know what had happened to Sam, but I just lay there and pretended to sleep. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to say anything to anybody. I just wanted to try to forget the horrors I'd seen underground. I started writing this the next day after breakfast, and I'm going to try to get it to my people on the outside. There's something beneath the prison that has to be rooted out. Sam's belongings have been moved. His name no longer appears on the call-out or the work squad schedule. It's as though he never existed at all. What if I hadn't come back either? Would I simply be one more inmate that never existed? As I sit here writing, I could swear there's a rat on the windowsill watching me. He's just standing there, the rain beating on his whiskers as he stares at me through the day room window's murky glass. I've seen the guards watching me too. I've seen beady eyes watching me after lights out. Seen the way the dorm officer's eyes often track to me when he thinks I'm not looking. Just like the furry figures that stand outside the glass when they think I'm not paying attention. At this point, I'm not sure where I'm more likely to find my death. Will I die by the hands of the sadistic warden, or by the teeth of the Rats of Stragview and their merciless king who resides below?
Intercepted in the mailroom of Stragview Prison, March 16th, 2009. "Hey Mary, it's me, Peter. I really hope this gets to you. They say the mailroom checks all the outgoing mail, but I hope this letter slips through somehow. I've really messed up this time, Mary. Worse than all the other times. I'm sitting in a 10 by 12 concrete box, surrounded by other noisy inmates in similar cells, and I've never felt safer in my life. After what happened yesterday, it's a wonder I can feel anything at all. I had to wait a whole day to write this letter to you because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I'm freaking out, knowing these things are just outside the fences, knowing they could come in at any time and get me. I'm rambling. You probably feel pretty lost. Let me start at the beginning. It's been a long 3 years behind the fence. I've been doing okay, trying to make my time matter, but it's hard not to think about what you're missing on the outside. I've been palling around with some of the other guys who were in here for a hell of a lot worse than a B&E, guys that had figured out a way to escape. One of them, Marcus Reese, is actually a pretty big-time writer. He says he's written enough novels about crime, punishment, and life in prison that escaping one should be easy. Clyde, he's our muscle, figured out that we could make it over the fence if we had enough clothes from the laundry room. Booker, who works in the laundry, supplied us with the clothes so that we could make our escape. We had paid off the white nationalists to start trouble in the rec yard. It always takes a long time to set these things up in the movies, but you'd be surprised how quickly you can get it all together. Booker got our laundry bags stuffed with extra clothes. Clyde and I traded the white nationals a lot of our personal items for their help. Reese found some books in the library to help us make our escape over the fence and get into the woods. Stragview's an old prison with a checkered past, and it wasn't hard to find some books on it and information online in the resource center. Within 2 weeks, the escape went from something we had been joking about to a full-fledged plan that we were ready to enact. It was cold and foggy when we made our break. Given the weather, no one thought it was weird when we wore our coats and boots on the rec yard. We stuffed our blankets under the coats, those coarse wool things they give us to sleep under, and packed whatever food we had left in our pockets. Stragview is surrounded by woods, and we knew that we'd be in for a long run if we were going to make it to the perimeter. We each had enough supplies to make it through the night, and we were confident that we could make it out when we entered the yard. Reese had been talking to the guys in the maintenance crew. They had told him about a section of fence where the power wasn't working after a lightning strike last month. It was at a junction near the rec fence, and we knew that that would be our climbing point. The ruckus started after 3 p.m. Some of the WN guys started pretending to fight, and pretty soon everyone was getting in on the action. When the guards went to break it up, we made our move for the fence. We threw the blankets over the razor wire and were over the first section of fence and halfway over the second before anyone noticed. By the time they were organizing to do something about it, we were on the other side and making for the woods. We'd expected our escape to take time, but the whole process took about 7 minutes. The woods were about 30 feet of open grassland from the fence. We booked it, hearing the guards shouting behind us. When a shotgun went off, we all heard Booker fall down screaming. I looked back, seeing him curled up in the grass, and put on an extra burst of speed as our pursuers gained on us. They stopped to secure Booker, though, and that was how we made it to the woods and found safety. We all ran in, not stopping at the trees that encircled us, but none of us could have expected what happened next. No one came after us. We heard the dogs, and we could see the guards backing away from the woods, but no one seemed to want to come in beyond the trees and get us. "Hey, these pussies don't want to come in after us. Guess they're afraid of getting lost in the woods," Clyde said. That should have tipped us off right away. We started to move into the woods, the sun setting behind as we went. The forest seemed to be mostly pines, their needles crunching underfoot as we made our way deeper into the gloom. I didn't register at first, but the deeper we went, the more I noticed the silence. Clyde was oblivious. The closest he'd ever come to a forest was a park somewhere in the inner city, but I could tell that Marcus was troubled by the silence as well. Forests aren't loud, but they usually have some noise. There's always the sound of birds or squirrels or the drone of insects or anything that reminds you that you're in an active ecosystem. We'd been walking for about 3 hours when I realized something else. We hadn't passed a stream or a river or any kind of water source. I had 2 bottles of water in my coat pocket, and I knew that Marcus did too. Clyde had drunk one of them not long after getting started, and if there was no water out here, we could be in for some real trouble. The sun was setting really low now, and I wondered why we hadn't hit the road yet. 3 hours was a lot of walking. We should have hit something by now. A road, a trail, an old trailer, something. And why hadn't we seen any helicopters yet? We had heard no pursuing dogs and heard no air searches being conducted for 3 missing inmates. What the hell were they doing back there? As the sun started to creep towards the horizon, that's when I first heard the noises. We'd been crunching along on the pine needles all day, so maybe they had been following us all along. I didn't think they had. I think it had only started once the sun got low. As we moved, I began to hear something heavy coming down on the pine needles. It sounded like a bear or maybe a big cat, but whenever I'd turn around to look, I didn't see anything. The others certainly didn't notice. They had started to argue. "We need to stop for the night," Clyde was saying. He had started to slow down a lot in the last hour and was clearly getting tired. You don't really do as much walking in prison as you'd think, and none of us were really prepared for a 3-hour hike through the woods. Marcus wouldn't hear of it, though. "I need to get out of these woods. I will walk until I fall down if that's what it takes, but I'm not stopping until I get out." Clyde scoffed. "You keep going like that and you're going to end up dead. We need to stop for the night." "Do whatever you want. I'm not stopping," Marcus said. Clyde started gathering sticks for a fire, clearing a place for us to sit, while Marcus just kept walking. I kind of wanted to go with him. I kind of felt like going with him might be the best idea, but I was tired and I really just wanted to stop for the night. I watched Marcus disappear into the dwindling light and felt sure that I'd never see him again. Clyde threw a pine cone at me then and told me to help out. The next time I looked up, Marcus was gone. By 7:30, it was dark. By 9 o'clock, you couldn't have seen your hand in front of your face. Clyde and I had managed to get a small fire going, and we ate our chips and granola bars sullenly. We shivered in our canvas coats, the garments not providing a lot of warmth, and our blue prison uniforms offering a lot less. The fire was a weak thing, but if they decided to send out choppers, it would be harder for them to see our light if it was low. Clyde had said as much too, but I think it was mostly to make up for the weak little fire. The pine needles didn't burn very well, and most of the wood was rotten and full of bugs. We had discovered this when we'd tried to pull a log over to sit on. It had fallen apart in our hands, wet wood spilling insects all down our arms. Clyde had shaken his arms and slapped at his sleeves, and then moved away from the squirming remains as they writhed on a bed of pine needles. "How was it so wet?" Clyde asked. "I don't remember it raining recently." As we sat in the deepening darkness, I could feel the wet sinking into my pants, too. Had it been this wet earlier? I put a hand to the ground and felt something sticky come in contact with my palms. I pulled it up to my eyes, squinting hard at the thick, dark mulch that clung to it. I shook my hand vigorously a moment later. Whatever was there, it had seemed to move. I came off the ground, swiping at the bottom of my pants and looking around in the scant firelight. I could just imagine a swarm of insects or snakes moving around me, but the needle-strewn ground looked just as solid as it ever had. Clyde sprang awake, looking around before settling his eyes back on me. "What's going on?" he said a little huffily. "Nothing, I guess. I thought I felt something on me," I said lamely. He settled back, but he kept peeking at me like he didn't exactly trust me. I curled up on the ground and tried to ignore the moisture that sank into my clothes. I was sure I could feel something moving under me, but I tried to get some sleep. Tomorrow we would find our way out of these woods and be free again. I had no illusions of a lengthy freedom, but I wanted to see all of you so badly that I didn't care how long it lasted. As I tried to sleep, though, I heard the crunching again. We had been making too much noise for me to be sure, but I didn't think I had heard it since Clyde and I had stopped for the night. Earlier it had sounded big, but now it sounded huge. Whatever was attached to that foot sounded like it was big enough to gobble us up in one bite. It crunched again, stalking in with low deliberacy as it got closer and closer to our little campfire. I lay as still as I could, hoping I wouldn't be noticed, as the thing dropped its heavy foot onto the blanket of pine needles. When it passed me, I had to stifle a sigh of relief. I glanced up, peeking through my lids to see the hulking thing that stood framed in the meager campfire. It was black, the guttering fire showing me a long, sleek body that looked more insect-like than feline. Its feet ended in killer claws that sank into the needles as it strode towards the fire. Its head was turned away from me, but I could hear it sniffing, filling its nostrils with a constant scent, and thought for one wild moment that it might be blind. It lowered its head to the campfire and sniffed at it, breath agitating it as it smelled the alien aroma. When Clyde began to scream, I had to stifle my own scream as the sound cut through the eerie silence. The creature whipped its head towards him. Clyde had been closer to the fire than I was, and he must have awoken to find the huge creature skulking near him. I heard him backpedal through the pine needles, tearing up the earth as he frantically tried to get away. That was when the big beast loosed the most unearthly sound I had ever heard. It was high and yowly, like a small animal caught in something. It stomped out the meager fire as it lunged for him, burying him under its bulk. His scream was muffled as the beast ripped into him, and at that moment, I knew that I was next if I didn't do something pretty damn quick. I lunged up, needles flying as I threw them up behind me, and ran into the dark woods. I was all but blind, the mood providing very little in the way of light. I bumped into trees and felt their surfaces try to catch hold of me. The ground itself seemed to try to drag my boots into it, and I felt the panic racing through me as I ran like my life depended on it. I didn't know where I was going or what I would find when I got there, but I knew it had to be better than this. After a few minutes, I heard something big behind me, churning up the ground as it gave chase. Trees seemed to whip out at me in that soupy darkness, and I juked around them without giving it any real thought. I remember when I was 7, we had watched Snow White on an old VHS player. I remember how that nightmare forest had terrified you almost as much as it had Snow White, and realized that that's where I was now. I was running through a nightmare, and my only hope was to wake up. I don't know how long I ran. At some point I could hear the massive beast chasing me through the woods. At another it sounded like a whole pack of them were coming after me. I heard the trees break and the limbs snap as they flung themselves after me with wild abandon. Suddenly I felt something sharp rip across my back, but my fear was so palpable that I barely felt it. If I survived, there would be time to assess my wounds. Now, there was only running. I ran for what felt like hours. My legs burned and my chest heaved, but I could still hear the pack behind me. They were close. I wasn't sure how I had outrun them for so long when my foot hit a hole and sent me sprawling. I rolled through the raking fingers of trees, and when I came to rest, I was sure I was dead. The pack would be on me, and I'd be torn to shreds. I hadn't seen what had happened to Clyde, and that had been a mercy. The unknown was much less scary than what I anticipated. When the blow didn't come, I looked back through my fingers to see that I was on the edge of the woods. I had come to rest in an open area, the night sky strewn out before me. I was aware of sounds of insects and night birds as they went about their evening, and it sounded marvelous after hours in the silent woods. I looked back at the woods, and I could see a small pack of eyeless faces, their heads smooth and bullet-shaped, their gnashing teeth looking too big for their sleek mouths. They slunk back into the woods, not daring to come out of their sanctuary, it seemed. My breathing was still heavy, but I flopped back onto the grass and laughed despite my terror. I had survived. I was free of the hellscape forest. When the spotlights from Stragview found me, I was almost relieved. I was cuffed and dragged inside the gate. I didn't resist. Why would I? I had seen what lay beyond the fences, and I was in no hurry to get back to it. They took me to medical, cleaned and bandaged my wounds, and took me right to confinement as they dropped an escape charge on me. As I was brought in, the other inmates tried to talk to me, tried to get my attention, but I was as silent as the grave. I lay on my mat and tried to sleep, knowing that my pursuers' eyeless faces would never leave me. I wasn't there long, though, before something worse came to find me. About an hour into my confinement stay, 2 officers came to escort me to the disciplinary room where they held DR court. "Warden wants to see you," they said. I accepted my cuffs and went meekly enough. Even at 1 o'clock in the morning, the warden looked resplendent in his pinstripe suit and little gold glasses. His salt and pepper hair was in the same crew cut he always wore it in, and the edges looked like he had cut them with a ruler. As he leaned over the desk, I could tell that he was more amused than angry. We see the warden from time to time, usually only during important inspections. To most inmates, he's almost a mythical figure. Like a shark, he only comes around when there's blood in the water. "Did you enjoy your little hike?" he asked. The lights from the fluorescents glittered off the lenses of his glasses, and for a moment his eyes looked as smooth as that creature's face. "I could give you an extra 5 years for escaping, you know. You've only got 2 more years, and I can tell that you're desperate to get back to your family. Why else would you run, after all?" I sat, saying nothing. He fixed me with a hard look. "We have one of them in here, you know." My eyes snapped to his. Over in Quad 2. A little accident a few years ago. He's still in there, though, and he's ravenous. I could see one of the officers shudder, an older guy who looked like retirement should have come a few years ago. The doors are sealed, but I'm sure we could arrange a meeting if you'd really like to see him. I shivered, not even wanting to know that one of those things was in the fence. What do you want? I asked, ready for this to be over and me to be back behind the door. We already have inmate Booker back in custody. Now we have you as well. Inmate Reese and inmate Dorn are still at large, however. I want to know where they are. For that, I won't charge you with escape. Refuse, and I'll deny we ever found you. The implications were clear. There would be no evidence of me to find. He would make sure of that. Clyde's dead. Inmate Dorn, I mean. Your creatures killed him out in the woods. I don't know what happened to Reese. He left before nightfall and just kept walking. I'd assume that he's probably dead, too. That seemed to appease the warden, and he nodded at the guards. Take him back to his cell. He's under investigation for the next 30 days, or until medical says his back is healed. If he gives you any fuss, you know where to put him, he said, fixing me with a hard stare. I'm writing this letter to you in the hopes that maybe you'll read it. It's not right what they've got in here. It's not okay to let these things loose on the world. People should know about what lurks in the woods around Stragview. As I sit here in my cell, I can almost feel their eyeless faces looking at me. I doubt I'll ever forget them. Hey, dumbass, can't you read? Stay off the warden's grass. I looked at Scott, the inmate who had been walking next to me, and saw that he had indeed taken a step onto the pristine grass that set between the concrete paths. Scott looked up, making eye contact with the brick of an officer who had yelled at him, and stepped back onto the sidewalk as we walked back from Chow to our dorm. He nodded to the officer, apologizing for his thoughtlessness, and turned back to look at me. His face turned sarcastic almost at once, and Scott theatrically rolled his eyes as the tide of bodies around us moved like blood through a clogged artery. Psh! Stay off the warden's grass. I don't see the warden out here tending it. That was true. In fact, no one had actually tended the now lush green grass that blanketed the spots between the sidewalks. It had, it seemed, sprung up overnight and was as lush and green as an oldster's lawn you might see in a nearly endless suburban neighborhood. Who could blame someone for wanting to walk on it, honestly? It was just so inviting. I'd been a resident of Stragview for about a year now, and would remain a resident for the next 2 years at least. I'd been brought in on charges of breaking and entering, and the judge had decided that since it was my third offense, a trip to real prison would serve me just right. I'm not sure Stragview is what you would call a real prison, but it's certainly unlike any prison I've ever heard of. The whole place seems odd sometimes, and the old-timers tell me that this prison is sort of its own little world. Case in point, the mysterious grass. As a member of the grounds crew, I can honestly say that I have no clue how it came to be there. We're experiencing one of the hottest summers in living memory, and the grass had been reduced to mostly dirt and yellow ghost grass. Granted, it hadn't been real great before, but the riots last year had certainly messed it up. The dorm fire and the trampling feet had left most of it flat and kinda crappy looking, and all attempts to seed and fertilize it had been in vain. We had kinda given up on it. It was, after all, grass in a prison, and no one cares if it looks good or not. No one, it seemed, except the warden. I had grown to hate working grounds in the late afternoon, primarily because of the warden's attention. He had recently moved his office into the old tower that loomed over the compound like a monolith. The place was supposed to be full of rats, at least that's what I had heard, and I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to be there. The rats were supposed to be territorial, and if you believe that one guy, there was a huge one that lived under the tower. He had told anyone who would listen about it, right up until Henderson put him off inside grounds. Honestly, I'm not really sure what happened to him after that. At any rate, I was talking about the warden. If the rats in the tower bothered him, he never showed it. He worked up in that tower all night sometimes, and if it was overcast or the sun was going down, you could see him pacing around on the catwalk or on the top of the tower, watching inmates and guards scurrying about below.
He would watch us on inside ground sometimes, and I could swear that I could feel his eyes on me way too often. He watched us seed the grass, water the grass, fertilize the grass, and always with that look of disapproval on his pinched face. Then one morning, we arrived to find this lush sea of green grass where the old grass had been before. We had been speechless. We had been prepared for another day of watering and fertilizing, but now there was simply this collection of lush grass in between the sidewalks. Even Henderson looked shocked by its sudden appearance. Rory had taken off one of his work boots and stepped onto it and told us it was soft, like the grass his grandma's yard had when he was a kid. She had some kind of grass with a hard name to say, and Grandpappy kept it nice and green for her, he told us. Henderson had been summoned to the tower then, and had come back with a very specific set of instructions. No one is to step foot on that grass, he said, giving Rory a very hard look. We are to put out signs. Each one of them is in a specific location around the sidewalk, and we are not to step on the grass while we do it. The only way you are permitted on that grass is if you're riding one of those new lawnmowers. This is extremely important. Do not ever set foot on that grass. That's a direct order from the warden. And what if we do? Asked Jax, an imposing inmate who seemed to live to be contrary. Henderson gave him a hard look and said, Then I lock your ass in confinement, and we see how you feel about that. So we set out the signs, and only stepped foot on the grass to step onto the new riding lawnmowers the warden had bought for us to maintain the grounds with. I, for one, didn't like to ride the mowers. I was one of 4 inmates who was allowed to ride them, of course. Certain members of the grounds crew were deemed untrustworthy when it came to the mowers, so we had to take turns with them. Despite the heat and the drought, the grass constantly seemed to need mowing. You could mow it just before knocking off for the day, and it would need cutting again in the morning. The grounds felt strange when you rode over them. Henderson claimed it was the vibrations from the mower, but I know what I felt as it chugged over those small patches of ground. It was like being on a boat when something large swims beneath it. I guess I learned how right I was about it a week later. Scott and I walked back after we'd been chastised for stepping on the grass, and he muttered and griped the whole way back to the dorm. We fell in line with the rest of them as they tried to make their way back, and Scott seemed to seethe all the more as he waited in line. Scott was someone whose parents had probably never told him no, and it had most certainly brought him to this point in his life. He hated authority, but seemed overall cowardly once confronted by them. This was typical behavior for him, and I just rolled my eyes as he sat there muttering to himself. Just friggin' grass. Don't see why I'm just such a dick. Tell me. I'll show. Just let it go, dude. No one is supposed to walk on the grass. Did you think they made an exception just for you? Hell, I take care of the grass, and I'm not even supposed to walk on the grass. It's so stupid, though. What possible harm could come from walking on the grass? Well, if you do it, then other people will think they can do it. Pretty soon, the grass looks like crap, and then I have to work twice as hard to make it look nice. Maybe they just want something nice for a change. I don't know, but it's a rule, and we have to follow it, no matter how stupid we think it is, I added with a little wink. It's so stupid, he raged. You just know the guards are out there laying in the grass after they put us up for the night. Why the hell can't they just let us have something nice too? I agreed with him, but silently I doubted it. The guard earlier, that brick that was de Bontar, had sounded angry about having to tell Scott to get off the grass, but there had also been something else below the surface. Had it been fear? Not fear of a reprimand, but maybe fear of something else? Scott hadn't noticed, but I thought, just for a second, I had seen him glance around the grounds in a strange, fitful way, like a man on a boat checking for sharks after someone falls overboard. Henderson looked around like that sometimes too, his usual placid face watchful as he worked. He shouted more and lounged less, especially when someone tried to walk on the grass. This was new for him, and it had not gone unremarked by the other inmates. The guards seemed scared of something, and that grass seemed to be the reason for their fear. I got back into the dorm, Scott heading to the day room to watch TV, and I went to my bunk to chill out and listen to some music. It had been a long day of cutting grass out in the hot sun, and I slid my earbuds in and tuned on some music, closing my eyes and vibing out for a few minutes as the world just sort of passed by around me. It's funny how these simple pleasures can really make a difference in a place like this. I felt my mind drifting a little as the music took me back to a time before I was trapped in this bunk room, surrounded by sweaty, stinking men.
That's why I didn't hear the officer call me until his boot kicked the corner of my bed with a less than gentle impact. I opened my eyes to see the displeasured face of Sergeant Farcree as he tapped the side of his boot against my bunk. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I could already tell that coming out here to tap my bunk was not his first attempt to get my attention. I took out my earbuds and asked him how I could help him. For starters, you maybe listen up when I call your name over the loudspeaker. I've been trying to reach you for nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes? I haven't even been back from chow for... But one look at my watch told me that was a mistake. I'd come back at 5, and it was nearly 7 now. Had I dozed off? I rarely lost time like that, and the idea that I had passed out was a little alarming. Medical just called to let me know that you missed your pill call-out. You need to go get meds from the pill nurse, like now, before the sun goes down. I got up, slipped on my Crocs, and went with him to the door of the dorm. He got on his radio and let Control know that he had one inmate leaving for medical and let me out onto the yard. He told me to hurry. Count would be in about 20 minutes, and I left out for the medical pavilion. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was suddenly alone on the yard. The medical pavilion was on the other side of the compound, through the center gate, and into the outer ward, and it would be a long trip by the sidewalks. As I turned, taking the concrete path, making my way towards the center gate, I saw the grass that lay between and realized I was going around my elbow to get to my knee. I could just cut across the grass and be there and back before even anyone called a count warning. I knew I shouldn't. We all knew that we shouldn't, but it was such a short stretch. Plus, the grass was just so inviting. I looked at the yard and saw no one. I looked at the captain's office and saw no one standing around it smoking. I looked at the warden's tower and saw no one standing on the catwalk. I took a tentative step out into the grass and sighed as the light brush of it struck my legs. It was so nice, so soft, and Rory had not been wrong. I bent a little and ran my hand over the grass, feeling it tickle my palm as I went. I had never felt grass so luxurious, and I closed my eyes as I walked, waiting for someone to yell at me. I didn't care if I got chastised. I was enjoying my time in the grass, and I walked slowly through the tickling bristles. I was halfway across the 15-foot stretch of grass when I felt that small boat, large animal feeling beneath me. I can't explain it. It makes no sense. But I was suddenly moved to run. I needed to run flat out, get back to dry land as quickly as possible. I ran, despite running being the biggest no-no of them all. People who ran in prison drew attention. Running means an emergency, and it was the first thing they taught you not to do. I felt the grass tickle me as I ran, that feeling of enjoyment melting away. The tickle was now something akin to whiskers of some animal that ran over my nerves. That swelling feeling beneath me grew, like a whale getting ready to breach, and I jumped the last few feet to make it to the concrete. I fell on my hands and knees, bloodying my hands and scuffing my knees as I came onto the sidewalk. I turned my head, expecting to see something split the ground, but there was nothing. The grass waved placidly, the night birds called softly, and the compound seemed peaceful. I walked in a fitful mess, the grass on either side of me looking deceptive as I walked. Every stalk seemed to wave to me, seemed to entice me, seemed to say, "Come frolic in me, it's okay." I could remember a picture book from when I was a child about a choo-choo train that had gotten in trouble for playing in buttercups, and the grass looked like those buttercups had. So warm, so inviting, so much like a trap. I walked to the medical pavilion as sunset set around me, feeling so much better once I got past the center gate. I was stuck in medical for count. I had taken longer than I thought, I guess, and when I got out, it was nearly full dark. I had almost forgotten about the grass somehow, though I'm not sure how. Seeing it again made me remember the experience anew, though. I stopped at the gate, looking out at all that grass, and felt my legs getting shaky. I didn't feel like I had the strength to walk back across that grassy field, even on the sidewalk. I clung to the fence as I waited for someone to notice me. At that point, I would have gone to confinement
if it meant I didn't have to face that swaying green trap again. Unfortunately, someone wearing blue found me first. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" I turned and found Jensen, an inmate I knew from around the compound. Jensen volunteered to work inside grounds sometimes, and was just an all-around nice guy. He lived in a different dorm than I did, but he was well known for being a hard worker and a go-getter. He appeared to have been coming out of medical, and I remembered that he was an orderly. He was probably just getting off of work, and he looked around the yard as the post lights came on, bathing the grass in a bright light. "Looks like a pretty night. Need a hand back to your dorm?" He could clearly see that I was in distress, and his first impulse seemed to be to help me. I thanked him, and the two of us started making our way back to my dorm. As we walked, he babbled on about a long old day, and I must have looked half crazy as I walked beside him and craned my neck around in paranoia. I felt like something in that grass was watching me, and it seemed odd that there were no guards around either. Where the hell was everyone? Inmates weren't usually allowed to just stroll along after dinner time. The absence of guards made it all seem worse, and I found myself turning my head fitfully as we walked. When we came to my dorm, I sighed and turned to thank Jensen. I felt pretty silly now, being spooked by whatever that had been, and I hoped Jensen wouldn't tell people what a friggin' scaredy cat I had been. I had acted like a damn child, and now that I was back at my own door, I couldn't imagine why I had been so spooked. "No problem at all," Jensen said. "You know, since no one's out here, I think I'm going to run back through that grass and get back to my dorm. It looks so soft, like that grass my dad used to fuss with back home." I tried to warn him not to, but he took off running towards the stretch between my dorm and his dorm. I saw him slip off his Crocs as he got to the edge and run barefoot into the tall grass. I watched him go, my warning dying in my throat, and I felt even sillier as he made his way through that luxuriously tall grass. Jensen didn't seem to have any qualms about the grass, and I was almost jealous as he walked barefoot through that tall, soft grass, right up until something breached the ground and swallowed him in a single bite. It dove back down like an orca picking off a bird from the surface, and the ground and the grass looked just as it had before. The officers came running when I started screaming. They came from the captain's office and from the dorms and from all over to see why an inmate was out after dark and screaming like a lunatic. They drugged me off to a show cell in medical, and I spent the next few days eating food off a styrofoam tray and gibbering about grass monsters and Jensen's disappearance. They let me sit in there for 3 days, raving and ranting, before the warden came out of his tower to have a look at me. I can still remember him sitting there in his pinstripe suit and little gold glasses, staring hungrily at me through the glass. "I understand you saw something the other night." I nodded, preparing to speak, but he cut me off. "I'd suggest that if you ever want to get out of this place, you forget what you saw and go right on cutting that grass and not thinking about it. Oh," he said before turning to go, "do continue to tell your friends to stay off the grass, though." My hospital stay was almost a month behind me now, and I've nearly convinced myself that I hallucinated the whole thing. Every time I notice Jensen is gone, though, I remember and have to resist the urge to go batshit crazy all over again. I wouldn't even be writing this, but I need someone to get me out of here after what I saw today. I can't stay here another minute, not knowing what I know. I was on my mandatory day off. We get at least one a week, and I was walking the track on the rec yard. I used to play basketball, or lift weights, but these days I seem to be just listing through my stay here like a ship with no rudder. I was circling the track by the back fence when something caught my eye and made me leave the track for the grassy area in between. Normal grass, yellow dead grass, not that weird grass like out on the compound. Not that weird grass like I saw beyond the fence. I started walking towards the fence, ignoring the guards who yelled at me as I wrapped my fingers around the cold links. I could hear them calling me again, but I barely noticed. Outside the fence, butting up against the woods themselves, was a thick wall of tall grass. It was lush and green and unending, and as I watched, the grass rolled like a tide
as whatever resided within it moved about, looking for its next victim. So, Mr. Mason, if any part of this letter reaches you, I beg you to get me a transfer somewhere else. Otherwise, I might not make it out of these walls alive.
The following was found scribbled on the back of a log after the night of October 5th, 2008. Attention, night shift staff. Be advised that there is a water restriction in place until further notice. The water has been determined to contain a harmful chemical that may cause extreme health risks. The warden will advise when the water restriction is lifted. I looked over at the day shift officer, who was collecting his things and preparing to leave. What's all this about? He looked at me absent-mindedly and scrunched his face up in deep thought. I relieved McMillan most days, and he always managed to look like conscious thought was a lot of effort. He never struck me as a deep thinker. The longer I interacted with him, the more I realized that the department's standards were slipping pretty low if he had made the cut. McMillan looked like the effort of flexing all 12 of his brain cells might start a fire, and it took him a few minutes before he came up with an answer. Oh yeah, not supposed to use the water. Major said so when he came to put up the sign. I rolled my eyes. McMillan had told me nothing that I couldn't have gleaned from the notice. Yeah, but for how long? Till you hear otherwise, I guess, he said with a shrug. Then he left, and it was just me in the dorm and 150 warm bodies. This was gonna make my life just ducky, I could already tell. The complaints started almost immediately. The heat from McMillan's backside hadn't even adequately cooled from the chair before I got my first complaint of the night. The dorm I was in had 4 quads that held about 30 to 40 people per quad. On average, I have about 120 people, and tonight they were all mad about the lack of water. The fellow at the squawk box, his fingers smashing the button hard enough to go through the wall, looked like he ate push-ups and crapped sit-ups on the daily. He was bald, his black beetle eyes staring out of a face that looked like it was shaped from clay. He was looking at me through the glass as he pressed the talk button, which was making a loud click in my office. I depressed the talk button on my end and asked what he wanted. So, we can't use the water? I stared at him through the glass and let him know how great a question that was with my most convincing, "You're a real genius, champ" expression. That's what the sign says, don't it? So then, how are we supposed to take showers? You aren't. He looked back at me, his face looking like he might come up with another question if I was willing to wait. What are we supposed to drink? He said, just as I had given up on a follow-up question. I don't know. I'm sure someone with a higher rate of pay than me will sort that out. What about, I rode over him, if it's related to water, there isn't any, so stop bothering me. And that was how I spent the first hour and a half of my night. Different representatives from each quad would approach the box, their questions taking on different levels of elocution, until I finally announced that there was no water. I didn't know when the water would be back. If it made them feel any better, I also didn't have any water to drink. And it didn't look like management was going to send me any either. So, unless their further questions had to do with something other than water, and when it was going to come back on, I had no answers. After that, I sat in my chair, found a book that someone had left, and began to read. I could see them out of the corner of my eyes, though. Some of them had taken the news meekly, but most had formed into tight little angry groups that seemed to be holding individual powwows about the water situation. I saw a lot of furtive looks cast my way, but I didn't let on that I had seen them and just kept reading. The situation was out of my hands. If management wanted to send down some water kegs or plastic bottles or a goddamn tidal wave to wash us all to hell, that was fine with me. The weirdness didn't happen until about 8. No one had come to help me count, so I just hadn't gone out to count at 7 o'clock. This was not uncommon, but no one had called to bother me about it either. No one showing up might be an everyday occurrence, but the control room not shouting about it was something different. Control liked to have their count on time, damn it. If it wasn't called in, then there was hell to pay, and their lack of communication was unsettling. The radio hadn't made any noise either, but that was nothing to get excited about. I might have had a bad radio. It was always possible that, for once, no one had anything to say. These thoughts soon slipped out of my mind, however, when Wharton approached the fountain. Now, Wharton was a typical inmate. He was slight, pigeon-chested, with a uniform that hung off him and a shaved head that was sprinkled with stubble. While the others had been holding a council, Wharton had been staring at the water fountain. After about an hour and a half, I'd only been pretending to read my book, and was instead staring at him over the top of the Stephen King novel I had found under the desk. His simple, inbred face was held in the mirage-like grip of the silver drinking fountain, and he darted his tongue across his parched lips as he thought about the bounty that must be inside. He had likely drunk something today, a beverage with lunch, or a sip of something cool from the keg they kept on the yard that was refilled by maintenance. But it's strange how being told that you can't have something makes it so important to you. I watched as he got up after staring at the thing for nearly an hour and a half. He walked over to press the button, and I expected nothing to come out but a little puff of air and disappointment. To my surprise, a stream of water arced into the bowl of the fountain. Wharton looked at it with surprise, as a smile stretched across his face and he began to drink. The others in Quad 2 looked over at Wharton and seemed to notice that the water was working again. They glared over at me. Why hadn't I told them about this revelation? They went to stand behind Wharton as he drank from the fountain, wanting their turn at the cold, crisp water. His smiling face was gulping it down as he looked euphoric, but after a few moments, his laughing friends became less friendly. They slapped at Wharton, wanting to drink some of the water as well. The bald one who had asked the initial question pushed him out of the way like a rag doll, sending him sprawling as he bent to drink. Wharton lumbered up like a wild animal, and the brute had taken no more than a few sips before Wharton threw him from the fountain violently, his head leaving a red smear across the wall. Wharton bent to the fountain like a starving animal. He gulped down mouthfuls of water, the rest sliding down his chin. The big bald brute came shakily back to his feet, a cut on his head leaking blood, and grabbed Wharton by the shoulders. I thought he might beat him to death right there. Instead, he tossed him back into the day room like a sack of trash. Wharton slammed into the concrete bench, his arm bending strangely as the other man went back to drinking the water. The others who had walked over with him stepped away, not wanting any part of what was going on. To my surprise, Wharton got up and staggered towards the fountain again. His arm was quite clearly broken, but he lifted the wounded hand to his mouth and sucked the blood coming from his purpling hand. I looked back to the guy at the fountain and saw that he hadn't even noticed Wharton approaching. He was drinking water like he'd never seen the stuff. The water was sliding down his chin, his throat working furiously as he guzzled it down, oblivious to the world. I turned back to Wharton and sucked in air as I noticed the shank in his unbroken hand. He had curled his broken arm to his chest, shuddering as it spasmed, but his other hand had found a short, crude little weapon made from twisted metal. He ran up to the drinker, and as his friends called out, it was too late. Wharton stabbed him a dozen times, but the drinker never stopped, never even winced, as Wharton rammed the knife into his kidneys. When the drinker slid down the fountain, his lips were still sucking at air like a nursing infant. As Wharton took his place, standing over the corpse as he drank, I heard panicked banging coming from the other side of the dorm. Robinson was my houseman in Quad 3. He was an older lifer who made the best of his situation and never complained. I had seen him many mornings in the day room, a cup of coffee in one hand and yesterday's paper in the other, taking his ease before he started cleaning for the day. He was an amiable guy, and I found that I liked him as far as inmates went. He was not the one knocking at the glass. His roommate, a redhead named Griggs, was banging on the glass window that separated him from the hallway and pointing to the shower in the corner. Quad 1 inmates weren't the only ones to discover that the water was off limits, but not off. I could see Robinson kneeling on the floor of the filthy shower, naked as the day he was born, his head lifted to catch the water falling from the shower head. There were others there too, 3 or 4 who had been trying to get him out of the shower and were now just as powerless to leave as he was. They were also catching the water, mouths open and elbows prodding for a better position. They looked like worshippers who had recently discovered manna from heaven. Their faces were masks of ecstasy as the water cascaded down the drain. The inmates in 3 stood watching them, some of them laughing, but others scared as they banged on the glass and tried to get out. I picked up my radio and called for medical. I had no other choice. I had an inmate bleeding in Quad 1, and I had several others displaying strange behavior. The protocols were very clear on what I had to do. I had to get someone down here to help. I called for emergency traffic, called for medical, and an A-team response. After 5 seconds of nothing, though, I called it again. The static had a pregnant dread about it as I stood staring into the walkie. The A-team response usually brought all kinds of people running. I was literally feet from the captain's office, and the fact that I didn't yet have people banging on the window was very odd. When I picked up the phone and didn't get so much as a dial tone, that was when I really started freaking out. The glass tinkled to the ground as I pulled out the emergency keys. I wasn't supposed to leave the station unattended, but this seemed like one of those emergency situations they talk about in training. I'd signed whatever incident report I had to after I'd gotten some help. I was way beyond freaked out, and I needed someone to laugh at me and say this was normal, tell me how this was nothing compared to the riots of blah blah or the incident in blah blah. The key slid easily into the lock, but the maglock wouldn't release when I put my shoulder against the door. I slammed against the door, the lock disengaged, but the door refusing to open. I crashed against it again and again, my shoulder burning, my nerves turned up to 1,000,000. I had to get out. Suddenly this station was about 2 sizes too small, and I needed fresh air and the sound of crickets. I needed to run up the concrete road to the control room, uniform left behind me, and not stop until I was sitting in my car, just my boxer shorts and my undershirt. I could hear the other quads banging, seeing what was going on from various vantage points, and wanting escape or answers or just reassurance. Instead, I slid down the door, sitting on the concrete floor and letting all the anxiety crash over me. It's midnight now, and they've all mostly gone quiet. I managed to make it back to the desk, posting up by the phone in case it starts working again. I wished at first that I had stayed where I was. The quads have devolved into war zones. Inmates fought over petty gang feuds, fought over misguided fear, or fought over the precious water that they all now craved. I can see some of them at the fountain now, but there are others in the shower with their mouths open and the water soaking through their cheap prison uniforms. Others are in their cells, heads under sinks, or even in the toilets as they drink and drink and drink. Wharton is still at his fountain. The others have left him alone as they search for their own water, or just hide and wait for all this to be over. He's been drinking for hours, his body expanding as he threatens to burst. I can see dark spots on his pants where he's messed himself, and I imagine there are dark spots under his clothes too, where his organs or blood vessels have burst due to swelling. His smile, though, is the most cherubic thing I've ever seen. It makes me wonder what he's experiencing as he gorges himself on water. I find myself looking at the fountain in the station and longing to find out. It's only been a few hours, but I can feel my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth as I watch the quads devolve into madness. It's funny what you miss when you can't have it, right? A few hours without water begins to feel like 1,000 years. Even though I know it would kill me, I still want it. I figure this will be the last thing I write before I go to the fountain. Maybe our water isn't tainted. Perhaps it's just the inmates' water that holds whatever this is. It hardly matters. I'm so thirsty now. It doesn't look like help is coming anytime soon. If anyone finds this, just know that I died smiling. Just know I didn't die thirsty.